Hey everyone, this time we read Revolutionaries at Sony by Reiji Asakura. So there's a lot of really good background here on where Sony was at the time and how Ken Kutaragi kind of fit into Sony. It's pretty interesting, especially when they dig into how Ken Kutaragi how he was raised, how he eventually made his way to Sony. It is mostly from the Japanese perspective, so you don't get a lot of kind of insight into what was going on in the US at the time, or really what was happening in Europe. Both of those markets are mentioned, but they're not really talked about. And that's honestly my major problem with this book, and it's not that big of a problem, but it was one for me. And that was just how they don't really go into the relationships between the Japanese and the US executives. It just kind of seems like it got glossed over, and they explained that there were, a few problems between the two, and eventually, Sony stepped in and reorganized Sony of America and put in new people and whatnot. It I wish they had gone more in depth on that and cut out some of the other stuff, but that still doesn't really kind of deter from the fact that this is a very good book. So Kutaragi had a really cool upbringing. At least I think it was really cool. He basically got taught the value of hard work by his father, and when he graduated, essentially high school, and I think was kind of deciding on whether he wanted to go on to college or stay in the family business. His father told him, "No, you need to go find your own way in the world. Don't think that you have to fall back on the business I have. You can go off and go do your own thing." So Kutaragi did that. He went off and he made his way through university, became an engineer, and he's a damn good engineer, especially from what's being said here and from the success of the PlayStation. From there, it goes into kind of how he got the idea for the PlayStation. So while we're getting into Kutaragi's sort of how he discovered 3D technology and was introduced to it, we get this story about Sony, which I found very interesting, and how they seem to have two competing engineering products at the time, which I found weird, but I've never worked in that environment, so maybe that's normal. It was mentioned how Kutaragi was working on a 2-inch floppy, and then there was the 3 and 3.5-inch floppies as well. And then the two teams that were working on them pitched these two different ideas to a corporate board or something like that. And Kutaragi's was not selected, but he was able to convince them to, hey, let's make this the format for our cameras and that sort of thing. So it showed how he didn't want to give up with a certain idea that he had, regardless of what was going on. It was kind of an interesting story, and it told a lot about Kutaragi and a lot about Sony as well. It then gets into how he discovered what was called System G. System G was basically a 3D technology, 3D computer graphics, and this was back in 1985, so this was pretty cool stuff back then. I'm just assuming it was a very primitive version of PlayStation 1 graphics, and if you've seen those, you already know that they're not really up to stuff today, but they still looked impressive at the time just because it was different. So you can imagine back in 1985 they probably didn't look all that great, but it was still a feat to even get them done and put them up on a screen. At the same time as System G is being explained, and System G gets explained a lot throughout the book, so if you do read this, you're going to hear about it repeatedly. It talks about how Kutaragi was not really happy with the Famicom's disk system, because he saw it as being well, this is already outdated technology, that sort of thing. That sort of shows what Nintendo was always doing, but I don't think anybody really knew this at the time, where they would take this was basically Gunpei Yokoi's idea, where he would take what was called withering tech or something like that, where it was already outdated tech, but he would take it and repackage it as something new and try to do some minor innovations with it, so that it would look it would still look good if you think like the Game Boy at the time. It would look good, it would be fun to play, but it would keep their costs down, and that's kind of how I imagine the disc system was. But Kutaragi wasn't happy with it, and he thought, well, we can do better than this, and that's sort of when he kind of pitched the idea of working with Nintendo on a CD-ROM system, which was at that time the Nintendo PlayStation, which you can find like the pictures of the prototype and everything. It did exist. It just wasn't picked up for a variety of reasons. To kind of get back to how Sony was set up at the time, and from reading this, it's just one of the things that I got. It seemed like Sony was very cloak and dagger with everything, where you would have people that were working on either a similar project to yours or a project which wasn't reliant, but it was another thing that somebody else was doing. And it seemed like the engineering teams were kind of like cutting each other down behind the scenes, or like the managers of those teams were cutting each other down. Because you read about how Kutaragi would start a project, or he was working on a project that kind of was in conjunction with somebody else, and he would share information with them, and they would kind of like stonewall him whenever he would ask for help. This is just one perspective, so we don't have all of them, but it feels really weird to read about that. Again, I don't work in this environment, so maybe this stuff happens all the time, but it just seems very, very kind of alien to me. But to his credit, it seems like Kutaragi was kind of able to work in this system and kind of find his ways to like maneuver around certain people. It's one of those things that I personally would like to honestly know more about. I would like to know how he was able to do that. But he was able to convince the right people in the right places to kind of support him on certain ideas. Or that, and it also seemed like some of the people, especially like the president of Sony, saw something in Kutaragi or saw something in the idea that he had, and they were willing to like put him in position to actually be successful. Because at the end of the day, Sony's a business; they're all about making money. If you have somebody that has an idea that's going to make you money, why would you not back that idea? So then we get into the part that I honestly did not like. It talks a lot about the marketing and the different like distribution systems in Japan and everything like that. And it goes into like some of the differences between the CD-ROM, and they call it a mask ROM, but I'm pretty sure they were talking about a cartridge because that's the only other thing that they could have been talking about, especially since they bring up the Super Famicom and that sort of thing. It was just sort of I think it was a weird translation or something like that, but I don't know why they wouldn't just call them cartridges, but yeah, it's just one of those weird things that happens in books like this sometimes. That marketing and distribution talk, they go into like how they were planning on attracting third-party developers. Now, this was going to be really key for Sony because at the time they didn't have a lot of like first-party support like Sega and Nintendo had at the time. And during this part, there's one very strange thing where they start talking about Company A, Company B, and Company C, and I think also Company D as well. These are companies that apparently didn't want their names revealed, or for whatever reason, Reggie didn't want to talk about them. But from the descriptions, I'm assuming he was talking about, because they talk about two RPG makers, so I'm guessing they were talking about Squaresoft at the time, Enix, probably Atlas, and maybe like Working Design or something like that. I honestly can't tell, but I'm guessing they were talking about them. They also talked about Namco and also Konami and Capcom as well. And there's a brief second in here where he didn't have all the information that he needed, so the relationship between Namco and Nintendo is kind of iffy in the description that's given. So while reading this, I got some insight into what Sony was thinking about at the time, like who their major rival was, and who kind of the industry thought was going to be their major rival. And it was just very fascinating that they thought, Sega at the time, this is going to be the major rival to Sony, and eventually, like, they're gonna push Nintendo out. They didn't go into that, but that was kind of the thing that I just sort of gathered from reading it. At the time, this did make sense because you saw what Sega of America did, where they were able to at least pull even with Nintendo. They were ahead for a little bit, but then they eventually did pull even. And yeah, you could probably think if Sega hadn't repeatedly shot itself in the foot, they probably would have been Sony's major rival. They probably would have been more of a rival to Nintendo instead of just kind of like a one-hit wonder with the Genesis. And then when I say just one-hit wonder, like one successful hit, like because there are good games on their other systems, and the Dreamcast is a spectacular system, but they had lost all their momentum by that time. So when you're talking about the Saturn getting released and that being like a major rival to the PlayStation, yeah, in Japan that was true. In the US, no, it crashed and burned. But it's a very interesting thing to read about now, knowing what happened, and you read about what people were thinking back in like the early 90s. It was just kind of this cool thing to read about, and I found it really interesting because it was something I didn't know, and I'm always glad when I read something that I don't know. So like I mentioned, this was a really good book. I feel like I learned a lot about a part of the console wars that's kind of passed over, because most people, when they cover it, they just cover, Nintendo and Sega, and then Sony's kind of like a footnote, like, they tried to work with Nintendo, that didn't work, that led to the PlayStation, and that just kind of like killed off Sega, or at least, put a couple of nails in their coffin. And they were able to pull all the third-party support, which Nintendo had, so they kind of pushed Nintendo out of first place, and Nintendo didn't really get back to first, or at least maintain first for any extended period of time after that. That's sort of what gets focused on, but nobody really goes into what Sony was actually doing at the time, at least going as in-depth as Reggie did here. So yeah, this kind of felt like it was a fresh perspective on things, and I really enjoyed it. I wish we had heard more from, especially with Sony of Europe, because that just kind of got like a blink and you missed it section, but and I wish we'd gotten more about the relationship between, Sony of Japan and Sony of America, but, we didn't, so whatever. Those are just things that I wish were in the book. So anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody.